You had a plan, not a vague, someday kind of plan. A real one. You wrote it down, maybe you told someone about it. A business you were going to build, a degree you were going to finish, a relationship you were going to repair, a body you were going to take care of, a version of yourself you were going to become. You had the outline. You had the intention. And for a while, maybe a week, maybe a year, maybe an entire decade, you worked toward it. And then something happened. Maybe it was dramatic. A job loss, a breakup, a health scare, a failure so public it still makes your stomach drop when you think about it. Or maybe it wasn't dramatic at all. Maybe it was just the slow accumulation of small surrenders, the days you skipped, the calls you didn't make, the work you kept putting off until putting it off became the habit, until stopping became the thing you were actually good at. And now you're here. Not there, here. Somewhere behind where you thought you'd be. Somewhere that feels less like a starting line and more like the wreckage of one. The remains of a version of yourself who had more momentum, more belief, more forward motion than the person sitting with this right now. And the thought of starting over, the actual thought of it, does something that's hard to name. It's not exactly fear. It's something heavier. Something closer to exhaustion, mixed with embarrassment, mixed with a very specific kind of grief that nobody really talks about. The grief of losing the story you had about yourself. Because here's what you're really thinking. Not, I can't do this. You've never quite said that out loud. What you're actually thinking is, what's the point? What's the point of starting over when you've already started over? What's the point of trying again when trying is what got you here? Back at zero. Or worse, behind zero, carrying the weight of everything you already attempted. You've seen how this goes. You know your own patterns better than anyone. You know the initial burst of energy. You know the quiet fade out. You know the way you negotiate with yourself late at night, turning a choice into a conversation that never quite resolves, so you don't start, not today. Maybe not tomorrow. You wait for some unnamed signal, more clarity, more certainty, a better moment that will feel different from the last one. And while you wait, you stay busy with things that feel productive without being the thing. You become an expert at looking like someone who's about to begin. And underneath all of that is a question you're not quite asking yourself directly. Because asking it directly would hurt too much. What if this is just who I am? That's not a question about a plan or a goal. That's a question about identity. And that's where this actually lives. Before we go further, this isn't therapy and I'm not your therapist. But what we're going to talk about is grounded in real psychology. And understanding what's happening inside your head when you face starting over is worth taking seriously. Whether you're dealing with something small or something that's been sitting with you for years. So, what is actually going on here? When you failed at something before, or stopped, or abandoned it, or watched it fall apart, your brain doesn't file that experience under data. It files it under identity. It takes what happened and runs it backward until it becomes a story about what you are, not just what you did. And that story, once it's formed, starts functioning like a fact. Psychologists describe this as a pattern where we convert past outcomes into fixed predictions about ourselves. You're not just remembering the failure. You're using it as evidence for a conclusion about your fundamental nature. I quit becomes, I am a quitter. I didn't follow through becomes, I don't follow through. It didn't work becomes, things don't work for me. Your brain is trying to protect you. That's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. What looks like self-sabotage is actually the brain running a very old safety protocol. If you believe you'll fail, you won't be surprised when you do. If you don't try, you can't be hurt by the trying. The pain of anticipated failure feels smaller and more manageable than the pain of actual failure. At least that's the calculation being made without your conscious input. But that's where the protection stops being useful. The brain is a pattern recognition machine. It is very good at predicting the future based on the past. And in most areas, that's efficient. You don't need to relearn that certain situations drain you, or that skipping sleep makes everything worse. The pattern recognition runs automatically, so you don't have to. The problem is that when it comes to your own capacity, that system runs on incomplete data. It registers your previous attempts as representative samples. It doesn't account for what you know now that you didn't know then. It doesn't account for the small ways you've changed, the clarity you've developed, the resources you now have. It runs the old data and returns the old conclusion. Don't try because trying leads here. Martin Seligman, the psychologist behind the concept of learned helplessness, demonstrated this in foundational research beginning in the 1960s. What he found was that after repeated experiences of being unable to control an outcome, people and animals, stop trying even when control becomes available. They've been conditioned to believe their actions don't change results, so they stop acting entirely. You are not helpless, but you may have been conditioned by your own history to believe your efforts don't produce the changes you're hoping for. And from that place, inaction starts to feel less like a choice and more like a reasonable conclusion. There's something else at work too. Something specific to starting over rather than just starting. The second attempt carries the memory of the first. When you try something for the first time, you have the protection of not fully knowing what failure feels like yet. But when you contemplate trying again, you do know. You can feel it in advance. The anticipation of failure isn't abstract anymore. It's textured. It has weight and shame and a specific exhaustion attached to it. So the real question becomes not am I ready, but am I ready to go through that again? For many people, the honest answer is, I don't know. That's not weakness. That's information about how much the first attempt actually cost you. But the reasoning that follows is where things go wrong. You're treating starting over as if it's identical to starting the first time. As if the version of you who begins again is the same person who began before, with the same tools, the same blind spots, the same approach. And that assumption is almost never accurate. Now let's talk about what not starting actually costs you. Not the obvious version. You'll never reach your goal. You already know that. And knowing it hasn't moved you yet. The cost I want to focus on is quieter. It accumulates slowly, the way water damage works. You don't see it until the wall is already soft. The first cost is what happens to your relationship with possibility. Every time you think about starting over and choose not to, you're teaching yourself something. Not consciously, but the lesson lands anyway. That this thing is too dangerous to approach. That even thinking about it carries risk. Over time, you stop thinking about it. Not because you've made peace with letting it go, but because the mind gradually learns to protect you from the idea itself. Psychologists sometimes call this motivational foreclosure, the gradual narrowing of what feels available to you. The possibility stops occurring. And that is not relief. It's a slow closing of a door you never officially decided to close. Here's what you lose when that happens. You lose the version of your days where that thing is still alive, where there's still movement towards something you deliberately chose. People underestimate how much of a life's texture comes not from achievements, but from the active experience of working towards something. The project, the skill, the relationship you're tending, these things don't just produce outcomes. They produce a quality of daily experience, a forward-facing orientation that nothing else quite replaces. When you stop, you don't just lose the goal, you lose the feeling of being someone in motion. The sadness that comes from not starting over isn't usually dramatic. It doesn't announce itself, it creates a background hum. A low, persistent dissatisfaction that quietly colors everything else. You feel it when you hear about someone else doing the thing you stepped away from. You feel it late at night when the distractions run out. You feel it in the specific tiredness that sleep doesn't fix, the tiredness of carrying something unresolved. And then there's the identity cost. Every choice you make is a vote for a kind of person. Not a philosophy, a functional self-concept that shapes how you show up everywhere. When you repeatedly choose not to start over, you are reinforcing an identity built around not recovering. Someone who tries once and if it doesn't work, closes the chapter. And that self-concept doesn't stay contained to one area. It spreads. The relationship that needs work becomes not worth it. The health habit that failed becomes not for someone like me. The goal that seems far away becomes something other people do, not through any single decision. Through the quiet accumulation of a posture, a standing agreement with yourself that the cost of trying is too high. And the thing is, you don't notice it happening. You tell the story of practicality, of knowing your limits. And there's enough truth in that story to make it feel like wisdom. But underneath it is something that isn't wisdom. It's a slow withdrawal from your own life. The deepest cost isn't what you lose. It's what you never find out. You never find out what the second attempt would have produced. You never find out what you're actually capable of when you go back with everything you now know. You never find out who you become on the other side of choosing to begin again. And that unlived branch of your story sits quietly in the background, a permanent question you chose never to answer. So let's talk about what starting over actually is. Because it is not the same as starting. When you start something for the first time, you bring enthusiasm and ignorance in roughly equal measure. The enthusiasm carries you past the ignorance for a while until you hit the first real obstacle and discover you didn't know what you didn't know. For many people, that's where the first attempt ends. Not from laziness. From the collision between expectation and reality. But now you know where it got hard. You know what you underestimated. You know which parts of the process you were genuinely unprepared for and which parts you handled, the ones you moved through without knowing you could. That knowledge is not small. It's the most valuable thing you bring into a second attempt. The person who starts over is not less equipped than the person who started the first time. They are carrying substantially more. They just don't always recognize it as an asset. There's a concept in psychology worth knowing here. Post-traumatic growth refers to a pattern observed in research where some people, not all, and not automatically, report meaningful positive change after going through serious adversity. Researchers including Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, who developed the framework in the 1990s, found this pattern showing up across different populations dealing with illness, loss, and major life disruption. The science on exactly why this happens and how to measure it is still developing. But the underlying pattern is real enough that psychologists take it seriously. People who re-engage with difficulty rather than avoid it tend to develop a different relationship with their own resilience. That shift doesn't come from the adversity itself. It comes from the decision to move back through it. Every person you genuinely admire for their persistence became that person through a second attempt, or a third, or a seventh. The story you find compelling is never, "she succeeded on the first try." It's always the return. It's always the coming back that makes the story mean something. Because returning requires something the first attempt doesn't. The conscious choice to begin again when you already know what it costs. Now, about failure. You've been treating your previous attempt as evidence that you can't do this. But that's not what it's evidence of. It's evidence that you tried. That's the whole story. Failure is not a character assessment. It is an event. It happened, it contained information, and it ended. It is not a verdict on who you are from this point forward. Starting over is one of the more demanding things a person can do. It asks you to hold two things at once: the full weight of what didn't work, and a genuine commitment to trying anyway. That's not a small ask. That's not something a person who has given up does. That is the specific act of someone who has decided the unlived version of their story is worth more than the comfort of staying still. You are not starting from zero. You are starting from experience. That is not a disadvantage. It might be the only real advantage that exists. Here's the concrete thing to do. Not next week. Tonight, or tomorrow morning before the day fills in, you identify one limited, specific action that belongs to the thing you've been waiting to restart. Not a plan. Not a renewed commitment you make to yourself internally. One action. The kind that, if you did it, would mean you had actually begun, not just thought about beginning. If it's the degree, it's one email to the registrar's office. If it's the business, it's 30 minutes with a blank document. If it's your health, it's one meal, one walk, one appointment. If it's the relationship, it's one message, one call, one sentence you've been holding back. You're not solving the entire problem. You're not making up for lost time. You're doing the single thing that puts you back in motion. A person in motion is a fundamentally different thing than a person waiting to begin. This isn't about generating momentum through positive thinking. It's about something more specific. It's about giving the part of yourself that has decided you don't come back from things actual evidence that you do. One action is a data point. One action contradicts the story your history has been writing without your permission. One action is a vote, cast deliberately, for a different version of yourself than the one your past has been building by default. This is genuinely hard. Not the action itself. The action is probably small. What's hard is what it asks of you emotionally. It asks you to be willing to face disappointment again. It asks you to extend yourself a trust that your previous experience has made more difficult to give. That's real. But staying still is not a neutral option. It has a cost you've already felt. And somewhere underneath everything you've been carrying, you probably already know that your story isn't finished. If it were, you wouldn't still be thinking about it. It's not finished. It's asking you to do something difficult. To carry everything that happened and choose to begin again anyway. Not because the outcome is guaranteed. Not because this time is certain to be different. Not because fear goes away or the risk disappears. But because the person you want to become has already made this choice. They started over. So you start over, anyway.